migration stuff afterwards for 45 minutes. So my name is John MacArthur. I'm now engineering manager for GoEngineer in the Midwest. Prior to that, I was services manager for Design Solutions prior to the merger, and worked with at least half the room or so anyways on at least PDM something over the past few years. They asked me to put together a presentation on kind of preparing for and understanding PDM migrations, which was an interesting set of slides to put together for everybody because it's really more questions than it is answers on things in a lot of cases. And what I mean by that is effectively to better understand your migration, you need to know what you're up against. It's your data, right? So it's effectively going to be a lot of questions about, what do you have, what's going on, how much data is there, do you have an adequate server to do this, things of that nature. So I kind of broke things down into few different slides, and then I want to jump out into PDM itself and show actually migrating some data in. I've recreated some duplicate part scenarios and what to do with duplicate parts as you bring data into the vault, and 6 different options you got with those, stuff of that nature as well. So some top level kind of considerations when you look at migrations. Absolute number one question you need to ask yourself: do you really need all these files? Every single company comes to me like, we have a terabyte of stuff. I'm like, yeah, I know, but how much do you really need into your vault, right? And sometimes the answer is yes, you do need all that data. Sometimes it's not, right? Particularly, if you're talking about network drive migrations, in a lot of cases, when you look at workgroup migration, it's really all or latest, right? When you start talking network drive, sky's the limit. You could have the last 2 years of data. We could take what you consider to be current projects. If so, how do you define what a current project is, right? Is that something you haven't shipped yet? Is that like the last few years, something somebody's actively working on, right? And you've got to kind of put a definition on what that looks like and where that data exists, right? Big topic that comes up a lot as well is that data tied out to other databases. Is ERP picking that stuff up? Is it in some other software from the 1990s that's tied to, and are we extracting out of that? It's definitely a big part of it. One of the biggest challenges with network drives is half the time, or more than half the time, the end user doesn't even know what server it's on. It's on my G drive. Okay, that's somewhere out on your network, right? We got to find what server that actually resides on, and this could be coming from a variety of different places, right? I've had companies upwards of like 17 different network drive locations that are pulling off of different servers and want to consolidate that down. That's a substantial effort trying to get files, all the file references redone and everything else that comes along for the ride there, right? Probably the easiest question that you can look at when you look at a migration is how many files, right? That's generally pretty easy to quantify. You can just go to the folder in Windows, right-click properties, and it tells you that information. But if you've got 17 different spots, you need to go to all of those and sum them all. And generally, when I look at migrations, I get a spreadsheet together of where all the data is coming from and where it's going to. And once you get a handle on that, you can start to get into some of the other important questions. And probably the top one is, what are we doing with all these duplicates that are out on the network? The number of companies that do not have duplicate parts on their network, I'm not really sure they exist. Workgroup did a really good job solving that problem early on. So if you came out of Workgroup, that mitigated a lot of that. Workgroup didn't allow for duplicate files. Oddly, I've got a migration assistant utility that still tells me that information, and somehow there's a way to get duplicate data into Workgroup. I haven't figured out what it is yet, but almost every vault I see has 1 or 2 duplicate files that aren't supposed to be allowed in Workgroup somehow. But network drive, it's a rampant issue just due to the way engineers do business, right? They'll go find data, prior job, pack and go this thing and make a new copy of it, new, similar, but different job. And all of a sudden there's 17 versions of this bracket all over the place. Which one's the latest one? And I've got an entire slide talking about that mess. Looking at all the different various locations again is important, right? Another really, really big consideration is what custom properties do we need to map as part of the migration, right? One of the key factors of PDM Standard and PDM Professional is a concept called variable in the data card, right? And it takes properties and leverages them to make them searchable content. that only works on the way in if you have all of the variables mapped to custom properties prior to hitting the copy and paste operation. All right. If you hook them up after the fact, they'll start to work when you check in and check out your file, right? But if you don't have all that done ahead of time, you don't have a searchable vault when you go live, right? So that's a really, really big part of making that work. And I'll jump out into the software and show exactly how all those things tie together and make them work. And that's useful for more than just migration work. That's hooking up your title blocks to update when you push a property into a PDM file, things of that nature as well. And then on the IT side of things, and you'd be surprised how many customers just don't know the answer to this last question, is, do you have a server ready to do this? Right? It's one of the first questions I ask when I get on a scoping call about a migration, because they all want to migrate. They're like, all right, where are we migrating it to? I don't know yet. And they want me to tell them how big of a server to buy. And it's like, well, we need to answer all the rest of those first, right? And then some. So I've got a few more slides on kind of sizing a server for a migration as well. And then that new server needs access to all the source files, right? I've been in some nasty situations where I thought all things were tied together, and then, oh yeah, but the standard parts directory is somewhere else, and the server doesn't have that available, and all of a sudden we're rescheduling the migration, because without that, I'm breaking a bunch of references. And then lastly, on this slide, what should you do to test a migration? How do you validate that data afterwards, right? And this is one that I still kind of continue to struggle with, to be honest. I don't know enough about a customer's data set to know whether or not the migration went well, aside from the references look like they're there to me, and the properties are on the data cards, right? But you are intimate with your CAD data. You know when it opens whether it's right, so I need, an end user to come in and kind of tell me what, they think of the migration after the fact, and if it's what they expected to see. I ran into an interesting one recently in work group. Still don't know why this happened. Migrated everything. They're like, it all looks great except our folder structure is not there. I'm like, what? And sure enough, you go back into the vault data folder, and it's got a couple of top level folders that don't exist in the migration. And I don't know what went wrong with it, but if I exported ahead of time on their old server, everything came across good. But if I copied it and then made the export, it did not. So you definitely want to make sure that the folder structures and everything else stay maintained as part of your test, right? So kind of diving into what should you migrate, it really depends on a number of factors, right? Where are the standard parts is probably one of the big topics, right? If your company has a pile of standard parts in every job and we're going to continue down that path, then you can kind of skip that topic. Most customers are trying to get away from that if they do have that scenario when they go into PDM, and put a single standard part into the vault as the single point of reference that all the files will point to. The reason to do that, of course, is that your where used and contains tab actually works inside of PDM if you have that scenario, right? And then, in theory, if you are going to obsolete a part, have to replace it with a different part number, you know how many assemblies out in the field used that part and things like that downstream, right? That's very hard to do when you have the standard parts in every job folder. Do you have properties on those files that are searchable? And the tricky part to that is everybody answers yes. Now, when did you put those properties on those files, right? Did they change names over the last 10 years, right? Because that gets things even more complicated when you start to think about variable names and things. And there is no really good utility to consolidate variables. It takes custom programming with XML and things to get there. One of the questions I ask a lot of customers, on what you should migrate, it's really, depends on how much and how often you reuse your existing data, right? Some customers very much believe they build one-offs, and if you go look at their process, they do. Some customers believe they make one-offs, but like 90% of this thing's the same thing. It's just a little different, right? And then other customers, truly believe we, just recreate the wheel over and over again, because that's a lot of niche, design. So if you're the latter, bringing over the jobs that you're going to use for pack and go, for what they call copy tree inside of PDM, to get that similar but different job is very, very useful, getting that in the vault ahead of time. In fact, some companies go as far as to call those like a source or skeleton model, a master model, where they start that and then, start by copy tree and then put a job number to it and spit out new parts relative to that, referencing the old, existing purchase parts and things, right? And then define what you consider to be current data if that's what you want to bring over. Is that the last couple of years, open jobs, jobs that haven't shipped yet, is current to the last decade. It just depends on what your organization kind of believes with respect to a lot of that, right? Number one bullet on this screen, there is no magic utility that can pick the right duplicate file for you. Sorry, if I had it, I'd give it to you. It doesn't exist.
A lot of time.
It would. At the end of the day, I truly believe the right file is an engineer's decision, right? At best, programming and things can look at like latest modified, the newest saved file, things like that, but it doesn't mean it's the right data, right? Like it's probably the first place you should start to look, right? But it doesn't mean it's absolutely the right file, because unfortunately, when you have duplicate data out on the network drive, you could potentially have two different engineers modifying quote unquote the right file. And unbeknownst to each other, they don't know they're modifying a file with the same name. And when we go into PDM, if we've got duplicate blocking turned on, someone has to win, right? The other person has to change their part number. So, some decisions are going to have to get made about that. And you'll be hard pressed to actually even write down a set of rules that would even govern your organization, let alone everybody's. And that's why I think a tool doesn't exist at this point. There's a number of different options that you can explore when it comes to duplicates. You can clean up all your duplicates first. It's a big undertaking at some companies, right? I've talked to some organizations that were talking about it being like a multi-year project, trying to clean up all this mess, right? Because you don't have time at your job just to go clean up duplicates, right? You've got jobs to get out and things to design. So I've seen some companies spend some time trying to clean up before they move forward with PDM, and I don't try to push them off of that, but it's a huge undertaking because generally speaking, as you go to clean this up, you're breaking file references. And then you have to go fix the file references or hope that I fix them on the way into the vault, which has mixed results depending on a few factors as well, right? We can do a lot with custom programming XML and stuff, but the best case scenario for migration is that your data has good references on the way in, and then you get good references built into PDM on the way out, right? Another option, you can copy all the duplicates in a mass migration and then turn on blocking. I like this option probably the most myself. So if we have what we consider to be our standard parts library, and let's say it's 80% whole or something, right? Let's call that a starting place, throw all that into the vault, call that the standard parts workflow, check it in as a standard part. Then later, when you go to pull in your data, you can effectively, it'll block all the duplicates on their way in, and you'll now see this file's referencing the exact same standard part over here. And I'm going to walk through a little bit here what the button clicks look like, kind of consolidating some of those references and some of the different tools that you have. One of the really cool things with PDM, you don't have to open the SOLIDWORKS assembly to fix that problem, which is nice, because that's just a bunch of overhead and time. You also don't need a seat of SOLIDWORKS on the PC to do it, which is nice. You can actually update it all through the reference header inside of PDM, because it knows the references and knows how to rebuild the reference header inside of a SOLIDWORKS file. So technically, you don't actually need an engineer to do that, right? Which is kind of nice. Fixing those individual references at a project level can often be a lot easier to swallow than the entire elephant trying to fix all your dupes up front, right? One other option that I'll throw out there is I've seen some companies will throw everything in and then turn on duplicate block after the fact. And that's got trouble written all over it, in my opinion. I've seen a couple of companies attempt it, and in theory, it sounds pretty good, right? If we throw everything in now, we can get it all in the vault, and then we'll deal with duplicates later. And that's really not the way duplicate blocking works in PDM. Duplicate block is blocking the check-in operation. So if you throw in all of your data with duplicates, then you turn on duplicate blocking, the next time you check out an assembly, it's going to block the check-in operation until you resolve those duplicates, right? And I've had a couple of companies decide that's the way to fly, and I told them, you're in for it next week. Is everybody aware of what their day is going to look like for the next, 5-6 days of cleaning this mess up on every assembly they have? And almost like clockwork, by day 3, they called me tapping out. No, we need to turn this back off. Like it's slowing down production so much we can't get our job done. And that's the unfortunate reality of how much work some of these organizations have on their table trying to get rid of these duplicate scenarios. Now, obviously, if your company was diligent about uniquely naming your files from the dawn of time, you're not going to have this problem. Good luck with that. I think most organizations suffer from some form of this, at least, right? So those are a couple of different options, and there's quite a bit of information out there on the web about a lot of those things as well. But I'll show you some of the stuff here in a bit. With respect to property mapping, one thing I'd like to make sure that customers understand is that PDM is not only capable of mapping properties from SOLIDWORks, but it can do it from many file types. And it's done through something called attributes on a variable. So here's a screenshot of putting a variable into PDM, and I like to use description as an example because everybody has a description on a file, right? It's the single property that every single person has in the world. And here's an example of how to tie that to SOLIDWORks. So there's a variable name description up at the top, and the variable name is actually irrelevant. You can call it anything that you want, right? What the important part is down in the attribute field, if you want to tie that out to a file, you have to give it some form of block name. For SOLIDWORks and Microsoft Office, that block name is custom property, all one word. Right? And that writes to the custom property header. You can, if you prefer, get data in and out of the summary inside of those files as well, with just the word summary as one word. And if you're familiar inside of SOLIDWORks, that's effectively the first tab. When you go to File Properties, there's a Summary tab, and there's the Custom Property tab, and the third one over is Configuration Specific. And that has to do with some checkboxes on a data card, whether or not it writes to Config Specific or Custom Property tabs, right? The attribute name must 100% match the custom property name in SOLIDWORks, right? So number one phone call I get on tech support, my description doesn't map, or my heat treat doesn't map, right? And I'll go into their variable and look, and they have a space between heat and treat, or an underscore in one place and not the other. Has to exactly match. I don't believe that it's case sensitive, but I'm always just match anyways on the safe side. But definitely spaces will kill you, dashes, underscores, things like that, and they have to match up. And again, that's not the variable name, it's the attribute name that has to match. And then the bottom part, you got to make sure you tell it what file types this applies to. So currently, the screenshot that I have up, description will only try to read from and write to SOLIDWORks drawings, parts, and assemblies. And it specifically says at the bottom, these file extensions need to be comma separated with no dot, right? So if you want to add more, you just add a comma, DWG, DXF, etc. If you are trying to map to a DWG or DXF file, the attribute name is different. It's looking for the title block name to be able to write to a DWG file. Because it doesn't write into custom properties, AutoCAD runs everything off of attributes. So it's looking for the name in this title block, and then it'll write it to that location on a DWG file as well. All of these variables have to be put onto a data card. So you can have as many data cards in PDM Standard or Pro as you want, and you need a field for every single variable that you want mapped from your data. So the first picture I pulled up is crucial. The variable has to exist. The second key element to this is you have to have a field on a card for it. And you have to have that variable apply to files. So does the card, right? I got burned once on the cards. On the variable itself, the file types it applies to are comma separated. On a data card, they're semicolon separated. And it doesn't say so anywhere. And I got burned on a migration once where I put in the same three file types, but I put a comma there instead of a semicolon, and it applied to the first file type only. And that migration got all of their properties on parts and not on assemblies or drawings. And I got to redo it again over the next weekend. So for a comma versus a semicolon. So you need all these variables tied together. There's a really easy way to test though, right? If you lie all these things out, you think that they're what you want them to be, don't go pull the trigger on the whole migration. Go grab a representative file, drag and drop it into the vault, and see if it does what you want, right? Test that with a few different representative files and make sure it's doing what you want. And you can go from there, right? Revision's probably one of the trickier topics there, right? Most of what you see up on my screen right now is edit boxes from text in SolidWorks, right? Project name, project number, part number, things like that. Revision gets a little tricky because it's not just a variable in PDM. It has to exist as a variable, but there's also a counter that goes along for the ride there too, right? So if you have a file out on the drive that's at Rev D, when you bring it into a vault, we can map the letter D to that box, but the counter in PDM is at nothing. What happens on first release? It goes to the first counter in line, which if you have an alpha scheme is A, right? So you can release that 3 more times to get it to D, or you can use a command called set revision. So I can drag this in off the network. I can say set revision. One of the options in set revision is read the data card, and it will read D and say, okay, there's a D here, map up to D, right? But it's not an automated utility at this point. The only thing I've seen that will automatically stamp Rev on files is an import utility. So the worker migration utility or the XML utility has the capabilities to bump the counter, but it's effectively tying out to the API and saying roll the counter up relative to the letter. Right? If you're doing it on your own and you don't know API, setRev is going to be the only way to do that. The nice thing with setRev is you don't really have to do it till before the next time you release, right? So if you migrate 10,000 files and they all say the right letter on them, nobody's going to care until the next go around, right? So typically speaking, I'll pull it out of release, bring it up back to design again. The engineering process is now make sure the rev counter is what it's supposed to be, move forward with your design, re-release it. You just have to make that part of your process as you go to release files moving forward. Because it's probably not worth your time to go set rev on 10,000 files at once. You can do it, but it's going to chug for a long time in the database trying to go through that. And engineering will catch up real quick if they re-release something at A when it was supposed to be D. That's usually not something that gets by an engineer in my experience. So that's a few things with property mapping. The server side of things, big thing right now is going to be operating system, right? And speaking to that across the board, OS is going to be coming up on a pretty big change again. We dropped server 2012 R2 for last year's release. So we're into server 16 and 19 moving forward. And then Windows 7 is on its way out. You got T-minus 1 year, right? So you got any Windows 7 boxes sitting around, now is the time to start updating those. 2021 will not support Win 7. So that's going to probably, more than anything, hit our shop floors, I think, more than anything else, right? I think most companies at this point are at least up to Win 10 on the CAD workstations in a lot of cases, but the guys on the shop floor that are viewing files in the PDM environment are usually getting hand-me-down computers for the engineering, so they're the last ones getting upgraded, right? So just be careful of that. I've come into a couple organizations when 32-bit went out the window and shop floor still had 32-bit machines, right? So prepare for that as the year moves forward. And that's not got anything to do with migration. That's got to do with update. If you want to go to 2021, it's going to block you. And you've probably seen, if you've been upgrading SolidWorks, it's warning you every step of the way. Every time you launch that installer, it tells you about it. So, how much space does your server need? Big question. I get this a lot, and it's not a simple answer. For a migration, one of the things that I like to point out to people is you generally need a minimum of 3 times the file size. So if you have, let's throw out a nice even number, a terabyte of data here, a terabyte on your new server is not going to cut it, right? And for the simple reason of the way that PDM puts data into the archive. You have to locally cache it into a local view first and then move it up to the server. So can you get away with a terabyte on the server? Yes, if you pull directly off the network drive, you locally cache to a client workstation that has a terabyte of space to locally cache it, and then check everything into the server with that terabyte. That's going to be horribly inefficient, right? You're going to be pulling off an old server to the client and then up again. The most efficient way to do it is that you either have a map network drive or a copy of the data ahead of time, and then migrate everything local to the new server, right? And that is going to take more space because I'm going to potentially need a copy of the data up front, which puts me at 2 terabytes of space now, and then I need to locally cache it on its way in, right? So if I got to locally cache it, I'm up to 3 on its way to the archive side of things, right? So I recommend at least 3, generally speaking, for the migration itself. But you also got to keep in mind, if you're new to PDM, that PDM's growth can be pretty substantial with respect to the archive size, right? If you're used to working on a network drive, the last save is the only thing that's stored on the hard drive unless you did a save as copy. In PDM, every time you check in, a version gets created. So that can be substantially more data out on your server. I've had companies like, yeah, we're good for a year, and they call me in like 3 months. Like, we're not good for a year. Like, this thing can grow very, very large very quickly. And it all depends on how you do business. You know, how many users are checking in assemblies, you know, how many times you're checking in daily. Another huge factor, do you have big 3 files? I've seen massive archive growth if you have Ford Chrysler GM data in your assembly, because that 250 meg step is checking in tessellated to the assembly every time you mod the assembly and check it back in. And as an end user, you don't think about it, but if that was 250 megs, you checked it in 4 times today, you just burned a gig of space on the server, like that, right? So you can definitely have huge, huge growth. Now, there are things that you can do to mitigate that growth within PDM. Users have the ability, you can turn it on as an admin, to overwrite latest version during check-in. That's a little unnerving, right? You're letting the end user choose when to put a copy on the server and when not to, which to me kind of undermines PDM to a certain degree. Alternatively, there are some cold storage settings inside of a vault, and cold store has 2 functions. I'm not a big fan of one of them. One of the functions cold store can do is it can basically say, all right, these are all live archive files, they're old, let's put them over on this other server, and it can cold store things, which can sound like an appealing option until you learn that there's no mass uncold store, right? So if you go to an entire bottle filling machine here, for an example, and you say cold store that, all of those files will move off onto another server. If you then come back and decide you want to get that back off that server, you can go get them one at a time and pull them back off of that server. There's nothing supported that will pull everything back out of cold storage. I have access to a script that was written in Japan that corporate has told me looks good, but they haven't blessed, that will auto pull everything back out of cold store. But I can tell you this, in 15 years of doing this now, almost every company that has cold stored off to another server has called me trying to get back away from that. They did so to free up space, and what they did not realize when they made that decision was they caused themselves a lot of grief. Part of their goal was to reduce the database, and they actually grew it because the cold store actually stores more information about where else it put it. So you're actually causing yourself database growth when you do this, right? The other thing that cold store can do to help mitigate growth, though, is it can destroy old versions, right? So it can be set to store, let's say, the last 10 versions of a file, and then there's a setting in there that says, but never destroy anything that's Rev stamped, right? So if you had a file at E with 100 versions, you can set PDM up to store the last 10, and at most it's going to have 15 versions of a file. It'll have the latest 10, plus it'll always store A through E, right? And I find that to be pretty useful for most companies. That can help mitigate growth to a certain degree. As you make new data, you're going to get another 15, 20 versions of this thing, right? But you don't have 100 or 1,000. I've got some companies that started with PDM back in 2008 that are on 2,000, 3,000 versions of a file now because they've been checking this thing in for a decade, right? Or more now, right? So I think that can help, but you do need to realize it's destroying old versions. If you come back telling me you want version 1 of this file 5 years later, there's nothing I can do for you. If you got that on a drive someplace, if IT backed that up, you know, we can extract a single file out of an archive, but PDM, as far as PDM is concerned, it's wiped it out. It actually goes in and looks at that cold storage schema and schedules it for destruction off the archive, wipes it out of the database, wipes it off the archive on a cleaner service that runs at midnight. So just keep that in mind as far as growth is concerned with PDM in general. And then, you know, you're going to immediately duplicate your files into PDM. You can clear the local cache afterwards. I mentioned you had to locally cache it on its way in. You can clear that cache, which can free up a lot of growth space. But I would highly recommend having a lot of growth potential for the drive. Don't move forward with a server that's like close to its cap. That's generally not a good idea with PDM, right? You know, a lot of companies are carving out virtual machines now and then breaking SAN off of, you know, breaking space off a NAS or a SAN, and then you can set it up for growth, right? And some of the slickest setups I've seen actually have alarms set to them when they get within 10-15% of the size. It'll alert IT that this needs to get grown again or something, right? How much processor and RAM does your server need? The most processor you can throw at it, the better for the migration, right? To date, my longest standing migration has been 72 hours straight chugging on a computer. And that's on just a workgroup migration. I've done some network stuff that's spanned over a week, where I've just had to basically tell the company either put your business on hold for a week or keep track of every file you're modifying in the meantime, because I may or may not have got the latest copy whenever the copy operation occurred, right? It's also pretty brutal on your hardware. You know, when you hit copy paste into PDM with a mass amount of files, you're pretty much crippling that computer. So I would not recommend doing it during normal business hours if you can avoid it. Right? There are scenarios where you can't, right? That 72-hour one, it's chewing up a Friday or a Monday somewhere, right? Most of my migration work, unfortunately, is over a weekend or a night. I've got 2 of them this weekend after I drive home tomorrow. That's just the way it goes, because, you know, companies don't want that kind of downtime. And for the most part, it's a lot of babysitting. You hit copy and paste, and it chugs for a long, long time. At the end of it, you have to check-in operation, and it chugs for a long time, coming up with a massive check-in dialog box. And then you resolve any check-in issues, which is usually pretty time-consuming. I do have a couple of tricks I can show you for mass check-in that have saved me days of my life at this point. But you really got to watch out for cyclic references. And those are pretty nasty if you're not familiar in SolidWorks. SolidWorks does not stop you from making a file that references itself, and PDM does. So a lot of people are like, PDM broke my files. I'm like, no, it just flagged you breaking your files. That's all that happened there. So, you know, and when you think about processor, when you think about processor as well, you know, just keep in mind your SQL licensing, right? You know, it depends on CAL versus PSL and how many processors you can throw at things. How much RAM you need for a PC in general, you know, really depends on whether or not you're going to PDM Pro or Standard. PDM Standard has a 1 gig RAM cap, which you can throw, you know, 32 gigs of RAM at this machine. It's not going to use it, at least not efficiently. PDM Pro is virtually unlimited, so you have to kind of go the other way. You have to go tell the database not to chew up every bit of RAM and fight the operating system, because Microsoft has actually created a software that will fight with its own OS to get resources. So you actually have to cap SQL Standard in the other direction. But as much RAM that you can throw at PDM Pro, the better for the most part. Because SQL will just continue to cache more and more things into RAM than it can. Exactly what effect that has, you know, I'm still struggling to put a thumb on. We definitely talked about it quite a bit here at FOG with regard to that 1 gig RAM cap. And apparently, SQL Express does a pretty reasonable job of caching and uncaching that information, because, you know, corporate's recommendations don't put more than 10 users in the vault, and FOG's been at this for over a year with 40. So it's working, you know. So, you know, which, you know, how many users will be accessing the system concurrently is always a good question, right? And you just got to watch I/O and how much things get beat up. I'd recommend no users are touching it during the migration if possible. So I wanted to jump out into actually showing you some of the button clicks and how it looks. Obviously, I'm not like mass migrating thousands of files here live in front of you, because that's not going to work. But I have a small data set, kind of representative. Before I do, you know, you guys will have the download for this later. Somebody did a bunch of homework for me already. Another guy from Go actually wrote an overview on how to import your own files into PDM, and has like a couple, 3 write-ups that are like multiple pages long on some of the ins and outs of pulling your own data in, right? And I was going to kind of go through and write all this stuff for future blogs, and found it already in the Go's webpage, which is great. The other thing that I want to show you real quick, if we got time as well, is Robocopy. If you're not familiar, Robocopy is an awesome utility for copying files, and it's built into Windows. A lot of people don't realize that they already own it. It's just part of the command prompt, and it has a lot of really cool capabilities. You can grab files of a certain size. You can grab files from a certain year stamp on them. You can grab the last 2 years of files. You can only copy the difference. That's super useful with migrations, right? Technically, with a robocopy, you can actually fire a migration every weekend if you want to, and only grab the difference for a month straight, and eventually all that data will catch up. I do it a lot with server moves as well. Companies will call me up with a 3 terabyte archive, like, all right, we're ready to do our server move tomorrow. And I'm like, I don't know that you are. Can you move 3 terabytes of data overnight? Because if not, we got to time that, right? And robocopy can go a long way with that, right? I can robocopy the archive once, and then next week when you say you're ready to rock, we can then robocopy the differencing in the archive, take the database over, and stand everything up in pretty quick order. So there's some pretty cool stuff with robocopy as well that we're seeing. Straight copy and paste into a vault, and I'm not going to spend any time with workflows and all that stuff at this point. What I've got right here is just a simple project. My demo vault has 2 real important things going on in it with respect to data. I have a project that I like to use to show companies how to make similar but different machines with copy tree, and that has a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 job number in front of it, right? I took the exact same data and put it into this 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 project, or I'm going to as part of the demo, and this will cause me some grief with some standard parts that I have thrown in the vault on purpose, right? And then here under the top level, I have that standard parts directory, and then for the sake of the demo, I just put a clamp in here that's effectively a standard part that's going to throw me a problem as I go to drag and drop that data into the vault. Right? Jump out to there. So I just threw the same project out here, kind of representing a network drive file. One thing you want to be careful of, and this kind of goes across the board, is everybody's network drive the same letter? If not, are we going to go to UNC path? What SOLIDWORKS got in the header, right? G or S or Z drive can be kind of a cumbersome thing. And done well, IT has mapped everybody's letter the same to every location. Not necessarily seen that be the case in all companies, right? So that could get really hairy. And quite frankly, their SOLIDWORKS is already broken, right? Because as you go to open on one person's computer, if it thinks the files are on G drive, you go to open another person's computer and that same map drive is S, it already doesn't know where to find them. That user then opens it up and remaps the files to S and then breaks the guy who says G, and they just fight back and forth until they call tech support. So the files that I have here, just a real simple NC machine. And I want to point out a couple really important things with respect to bringing your data in. I've very purposely put all of the files for this assembly into one directory because that's the best case scenario. Right? A lot of people assume they're breaking references as they bring things into PDM, and it's all about the way that you do it. So I'm first going to do it wrong. If I bring in this assembly, right, and let's say the parts were in a different directory or something, if I go to check in set assembly now, it of course doesn't have the references that it's looking for, right? If I then go put in all the parts to the same directory and check in and out the same assembly again, it does not fix that assembly, right? Because your opportunity to fix this is 100% in the copy operation on the way in, right? And I've done a bunch of testing to come to this conclusion. So I would not recommend piecemealing in your work, right? Whenever possible, you want to bring everything in at the same time. As I go to bring in all of these files, it's immediately throwing me a warning saying, hey, this clamp already exists. And I think I've got a local version of it here within the vault. But point being, when I go to check this file in, you'll notice I'm not getting all of that outside the vault reference error problem now, right? It is now referencing all of the files during the drag and drop operation. So it can find some things in the same directory if you move them over separate, but if they're coming from 2 different locations, I've had a lot more success using robocopy to consolidate the reference, or a pack and go to consolidate the references ahead of time and getting them into one structure before they come into PDM, or copying the entire top level structure in all at once, right? So when I go to look at a network drive migration, I'm looking to see, is there a hierarchy to this? If everything lives in engineering and then 7,000 subdirectories underneath of that, and we're talking about bringing in all of engineering, this is probably going to go pretty well, right? If standard parts is off in another directory, not under engineering, we've got other considerations to take into account, right? Because if those both don't get copied at the exact same time, I'm breaking all my standard part references there as well, right? Which is going to be problematic. So, you know, so I try to copy all that stuff in all at once if possible, or I'll show you some utilities to repoint your references as well, right? Well, let's see, I'm going to try wipe that, bring it in one more time. I want to see, it should throw me a duplicate file warning here with that clamp. That's interesting. Let's go see if I got it turned off. So I'll use this as an opportunity to go show you where duplicate file blocking is on. I guess I just assumed when I moved my vault that came along for the ride. No, I guess it doesn't. So here under file types, duplicate file names should be turned on. That's interesting. I don't know why I'm not flagging that clamp part as a dupe. I deleted the one, but was I in? I was in standard parts. I got both of them. Gotcha. Thank you. Cool. Let's show you how to go get that back. So use this as an opportunity to show you how to undelete something. So if you ever delete something you don't mean to in PDM, right-click, go to Properties on the folder. It'll be under Deleted Items. Go find that file and recover, right? And that will get that'll get your deleted items back, right? Provided you have user rights to do so. If you see Recover grayed out, admin needs to turn on Recover from Recycling Bin. Every implementation I set up, if you have delete rights, you have recover rights.
And that has to have been checked in once it's lost, correct?
Yes, I think deleted local is gone. So that should put that back. Yep. So that puts that one there. Sorry about that. I meant to throw my duplicate data in here. So what I'd like to see occur here is now I've got that duplicate part, and this is kind of recreating the scenario of we already have our standard parts checked into the vault, and I'm throwing in a project now, right? So it's popping up here saying, hey, very clearly, you know, this references clamp. You brought a clamp in. We already have one of those. It's right here. I've very strongly requested to corporate that there's a button on this screen that says fix that for me. Right? Yeah. But it does not do that. Yep, you do, right? So what I wanted to show you was the button clicks to get through this. But what I've really asked from corporate here is, can't I just have a reference the one in the vault already button, right? Yeah. Like, isn't that what we always want to do here? I don't know. You know, like, yeah, pick which one you want and go with it, right? At this point, the best it's got is export this list and deal with it later, right? So hit close to that. Now, here's one trick that I have found is I go to check in the assembly now. And I mentioned that it blocks the check-in op. But importantly, it only blocks the check-in op for the file that is a duplicate, right? So it's going to let me check in the rest of that assembly. It's still referencing that duplicate currently, right? So it didn't break the assembly, technically. If I open that in SOLIDWORKS, it still resolves the local clamp, right? But it will let me check this in. And without opening it in SOLIDWORKS, what I wanted to show everybody...
Is that setting?
The duplicate file blocking?
Yeah, I know that you're allowed to check that in when there is a duplicate.
Yes, I believe here...
We must have it turned off because we can't check it in.
The entire assembly, yeah. So that is going to be a user permission under warnings, check-in, and right there, you guys probably have that box on.
Yep.
File name on.
Yep.
Right? So if you clear that, it will block the check-in. It will block the check-in on the part, but allow the assembly.
I am going to go turn that. Because that's what you're doing, exactly what I've been shown to do, but I'm like, I can't even get to that point. So, all right, thanks.
Yep. So now, once you've got it checked in with the bad reference, right? Here under Tools, there is a really powerful command that does not have an icon called Update References. Sounds good. And update references is effectively your ability to update the file header in the SOLIDWORKS file without opening it, right? It does all of this through PDM because PDM now has a table built on this file. It knows all the file references and where they exist, right? So all it's doing is going and saying, go find the right files. So as you pull this up, it's going to grab that given assembly. And then I can see here that it's still referencing the local clamp that I don't want it to, right? Now I can double click and I can go browse to the clamp in the clamp directory, right? But I don't want to do that, right? I want to just search for it. So if you go here, I can now just say, well, I know it's somewhere in the standard parts directory, right? You go here, you want to make sure this box is unchecked. This burned me the first few times I tried to show this. I'm like, look, it finds the clamp, and then it doesn't come back with anything, right? And it's because of this checkbox. It's only search for files listed with warnings, right? And if that file doesn't have a warning on it in PDM, it skips that one, right? You'll definitely want search subfolders on unless you're drilling down to the clamp folder, right? But it's fast enough to where I would just go right to the top and say search sub, and it will go find that given clamp and say, hey, that's not in the right directory, right? Where do we want to put that? And finish from there and rebuild that. Okay? And now you can see here that clamp is now pointing to the standard parts folder. Right? And that's a real fast compared to opening it in SOLIDWORKS and dealing with that way to handle that. And then you hit update, it updates the database, updates the headers inside of that. And then as you go to check this file back in, you'll notice here it's still throwing me the file name not unique, and it's because of the local file. So what I found is once you've updated the header, go delete the clamp, and your next check-in op finds the right one. And now that clamp is going to the one in the standard parts, referencing the one in the standard parts, and that assembly has now successfully been migrated, pointing to the standard parts directory that's in the vault.
Is that also what that was? You said it was local, but is it also in the same folder that you're in?
Yeah. That's more what I meant, I suppose. It doesn't matter if it's locally cached, I don't believe it's because it's in the same directory still. But that alone by itself should be worth its weight in gold if you need to do that. It's a really important functionality. Otherwise, you're in SOLIDWORKS trying to repoint to things all over the place, and it's very time consuming. Especially the bigger the assembly gets, right? I pulled an assembly with 6 parts here, right? I'm assuming everybody's making this bigger assemblies than that in the room, right? So this thing's your open time plus your repoint time plus your save time. Then you got to check it back in anyways to get it in the vault on every single file, right? And update references can go a long way with that. It's also really handy for finding files that you just want to replace, right? SOLIDWORKS Replace does a pretty decent job. But this can do it without even opening SOLIDWORKS, right? Now, I do recommend if you're going to swap it for a part that's not the same geometry, you open it up and deal with whatever happened there, right? You're going to have bad mates, references within the edges, things like that you're going to have to consolidate. But this assumes that the exact same part was in those 2 places and gives me a good file, right? It will still do out the swap, but you could potentially be opening up mate errors if that clamp was actually a different clamp, things like that. But that's a real quick way to fix a lot of your imported data. And that's effectively the real basics behind importing your own and migrating your own data. Obviously, that just scales tremendously when you're doing it with 10,000 files and 10,000 projects at once, right? And I have to get real familiar with your files in a big hurry to be able to come up with that plan. For better or worse, I've become one of the experts at migrations at this point. It is what it is. I mentioned earlier the mapping of properties. You look on the data card, I've mapped over nearly everything. I didn't put a doc number on those files, right? But there's your description came over, project number, project name. My name's the project manager on that. I put CBOM for the assembly material, and then the weight came across. You can see these files all have their own properties on them relative to that. I also purposely bumped the rev on my network file to C to show you how setRev works as well. Right. So you simply select the file that you want to update the reference on. You go to modify, and then you'll find set revision right here. If that is grayed out, you're missing some permissions. SetRev is a folder and a workflow state permission. So you need both to be able to do a SetRev. You click on SetRev, and it pops up and says, okay, what do you want to set the revision on, right? So I purposely made some files not have a rev. Some are on A, some are on C, one's on B, right? Because that's what you're going to run into, I'm sure, right? Arguably, the clamp doesn't need a rev, right? It's a standard part. So if you don't believe standard parts have a revision, you just leave that one blank, right? Some companies have, different, means on that. But at the very least, I need to catch up where things are at, right? So if I go here, the data card variable effectively is saying, C. The new revision within PDM is saying A because of what I mentioned earlier, right? And you can go here and say on card, right? So you can pick any rev that you want to set it to, but on card is going to catch that up to exactly what it read off of the data card, right? And I can do the same on other files if I want to do a set revision on those as well, right? So if I wanted to set rev on everything, I'll probably skip the one. I can say set rev there, and then you can set all of these to on card as you roll down through, and it will match out to whatever the data card variable is on that given data card. The one thing you want to be careful with is I'm not sure if you want to go to what's on the data card, and it all depends on your release process. So yes, the file on the network drive said C, but keep in mind, what are we doing with the data? Am I modifying to release D, or am I still working on C, right? Because if my next release is meant to be C, you'll want to set that to the one prior, right? Then on the next release, it bumps the counter and becomes C. If you're comfortable with that going to D, because I'm now working on the change to the one off the network drive, on card's the right decision. And it all really just depends on, what letter you want next, right? As the end user. And then I always recommend updating the variable, right? That basically says update the data card with the data, right? In this case, they match, but if you were mismatching, if you were going to B when it was already at C, you'd want to roll it back on the card so it showed B on its way to C, right? You click OK to that, and that should update all of the revisions relative to that. And now, importantly, that counter is in play so that as I go to change state and send that on to review, and then push this down to complete, it bumps counters and goes to D instead of A, which is what was wanted to do. So those are kind of the two big top level ones. Obviously what I'm showing here is the button clicks behind manually doing it, which is more importing your own files than it is what I would consider to be mass migration. You can certainly go through what I showed you with the mass migration on your own if you want to. If not, you can give me a call and I can scope it for you and get into that mess with you. And then, if it's a real hairy situation, it's probably going to employ some custom programming stuff. I've got companies hitting me up like, well, we got rev and description in the file name, and we want to extract that out of the file name and put it into the properties and then bump the counter. And I'm like, yeah, it can be done, but you're going to need an XML wizard and a whole bunch of time, and we've got a few of those on staff, so we can do that. But it's definitely an undertaking because one of the things to understand when you want to rename a file during that is you also need to redo all the references, right? As that file was coming across, it was called bracket 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and now you want to extract rev and description out of that, and it's not got the same name anymore. So part of that custom program is swap this, put it here, bump a counter, and re-reference this file, right, as it goes through the system. And we do have utilities to be able to do that as well. So I think that pretty much wraps what I had. Testing and validation, just make sure that you've got the space. If possible, get a copy of the data ahead of time. One of the things that we did at FOG testing that migration, we took a copy of the Vault data folder offline first and played around a completely isolated environment. We tested that migration a few times to make sure it was going to go smooth, and it did. And that's the key to it. Do not ever wing a migration like, we're just going to throw things into the Vault over the weekend. Like, it's not going to go well, trust me. Like, you need to plan that and time that accordingly. It's definitely something that you want to do. And then get somebody lined up that can validate the data. And that can't necessarily be me. I can only go so far with that. You need somebody that really knows the files. Can open them up and tell me what changed. Is it different? Does this act the way I expect it to as my engineering task? And with that, I'll leave you with some contact info. Go ahead and answer any questions you guys have. If it's just a scoping call to let you know what you're up against, I've got utilities available. They are VAR only utilities, but if you want to shoot me a call, I can give you a copy of the Migration Assistant, and it does a really nice job getting the report out of your even network drive data to see what you're up against. Gives you a report on how many duplicates there are, One of the really slick things it does is it's duplicate by file name, but there's a second column for duplicate by hash. So that's somebody copied it and renamed it and didn't change it. So that's actually geometry duplicate, which is kind of cool because you can't figure that out in Windows on your own. And it's got that utility. It's got a pretty good handle on what all the properties are, what revisions are on things, and then that can kind of help you map metadata properties, things of that nature. So, if you're interested in us scoping it out, we can. Otherwise, I can give you the utilities so at least you know what you're up against and go from there. So,
awesome. Thank you very much.
Yep.